Okay. So I think we have a pretty well-informed audience. If you weren't before, you are now. With that comes some responsibility, as Rick had mentioned, water stewardship among our young folks who will be making some of these decisions regarding our Great Lakes sooner than we think. No questions. Okay, our job is done here. We're going to start over here and move across the room right here. William?
One of the presentations showed nutrients. There was a map of nutrient use across the Midwest, I think. What's the source of that map? You showed like different components, phosphorus, nitrogen.
Yeah.
What's the source of that?
Yeah, so each of the individual sources, in that case, each of the individual sources was pulled from a variety of different data sets. Some of them we had essentially a census available at a county level, and so our job was to break that county data apart into a 30-meter map based on layers of like soil type, crop type, different land covers, things like that. Others are estimated from the bottom up based on things like estimates of crop yield in terms of nitrogen fixation, things like that. Others, like septic systems, were based on census numbers of households, and then septic systems were placed based on whether they fell within or outside of a city or municipal wastewater treatment facility, which there was a whole series of steps. So it's a many-step process to come up with those each individual seven sources. The one that's most direct is the atmospheric deposition of nitrogen, because we have raining out continuously. It's one of the larger sources, actually, nitrogen from the atmosphere. And that one, we've got enough data points to get a decent actual monitoring network to get a decent idea of how that varies in space and time.
So all of the presentations will be on the website, so you can go to them and refer to them. So
use the microphone if you could. Just pass it.
Microphone. Straight ahead here. Thank you.
Thank you. I got a couple quick questions, probably more geared toward Rick. Do you ever do any collaboration with the University from Wisconsin, Milwaukee, the new college for freshwater studies? And also sodium chloride. Are we monitoring and starting to get an understanding how that's starting to affect our Great Lakes Basin?
To the first question, I'm not specifically aware of a collaboration with the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. We work with a lot of universities, particularly in Michigan, but even beyond that. One of the recent experiments we've been working with, I think it's the University of Wisconsin out of Ashland, Wisconsin. We've been working with them on something called the Great Lakes Islands Coalition, where we've been looking at Great Lakes Islands and trying to get those people together to talk about their common problems. I suspect there's probably something going on with that university, but I'm not specifically aware of anything coming out of our office. To your second question about sodium chloride, the water quality monitoring in out in the deep Great Lakes is mostly handled through the Environmental Protection Agency. And they have a major research vessel that they use to monitor throughout the Great Lakes. That's certainly something that they're keeping an eye on. And we are aware of the fact that chloride levels in the lakes are slowly going up. It's not happening quickly, but it's happening inexorably, if you will. And there have been a lot of studies that seem to point to the use of salts for road de-icing. So that it's a long-term concern. It's probably nothing that we're going to be dealing with immediately, but it's something we definitely need to keep an eye on as we move forward.
Mm-hmm. Right behind you. Right behind you. There you go. Thank you.
I was wondering if any of you were aware about the carp tank. a carp tank competition, and the winner was announced, I think, yesterday or earlier today. And if you knew if the winner's project was going to be implemented at all, it's supposed to deal with the Asian carp and keeping them out of the Great Lakes.
We know a little bit about
I know
this.
just a little about that. For those of you who don't know, the Governor Snyder, Michigan, sponsored we refer to as a carp tank challenge, where he put out a challenge to innovators to come up with innovative ways to deal with carp. There was kind of a series of contests, and they narrowed it down. They had the final determination yesterday. The winner, as I understand, was I think a software developer out of Boston who had an innovative design for a bubble curtain that could be used to basically keep the carp from passing through the barrier in the Illinois River. I was a little disappointed to hear that when they interviewed him, they asked him whether he was going to use his $200,000 prize to develop the idea, and he said no, that he was planning to use it for other things. I don't know if somebody else will pick that up and do something with it at this point. It's probably too early to determine right now.
Interesting. Thank you, Gil. Since we're taping, we need to have the microphone to hear your question.
Yeah, I have a question for Ron. He mentioned about the fishing in Vietnam, and what is the new name of the fish that they're selling at Myers? From a consumer standpoint.
It's SWAI. SWAI. Yeah, SWAI or SWAI, yeah.
And are there other new species out there that we...
That's the only one we're concentrating, because U.S. Department of Agriculture took over that one fish, and they have to even bring that fish into the facilities. They live haul them in there. They have to slaughter, just like our cattle, alive.
Oh, wow.
So everything, even the farms have to keep records on water quality. So there's a lot of stringent regulations, and they do have an appeal into the World Trade Organization right now. And I know even Senator McCain and other Senator New Hampshire are coming up against that project, and whether I go back or not, doesn't make any difference to me.
My other question was, in Canada, you referred to the fact that the fish that come out there are so much more, there's so much more volume to it and weight to it. Do you know, what are they feeding their fish up there that they're getting a better...
What they're doing is, these fish over there are air breathers, so they can raise them at higher densities. It's a different species. They can come up and the oxygen levels, even USDA has these oxygen levels which are established for our industry in the South. They're down there well below 1 many times, 1 parts per million, where our industry is up there a lot higher because our fish couldn't even take those densities 20 times, what they're doing in Vietnam. So, and they feed them commercial feeds. Just like we do here. They have some protein, plant matter, and even now there's full inspections going on. All the fish coming into California, they open up all the boxes. They have randomized design where they come in and do the sampling. And there's concerns. I mean, they look for aquaculture drugs that are illegal or dyes, stuff like that. So, but they're doing it to our industry now too. So it goes both ways.
Thank you.
And Ron, I know you answered the question from the perspective of Southeast Asia. I think your question was about whether they feed the fish in Canada.
That was part of it.
Yeah.
The second
So,
part.
it's a
Probably.
pardon?
Probably the same kind of...
Yeah, it's a seafood ration that basically it's part fish meal, part plant-based.
Right. When you're dealing with like predator fish, like the salmonid, you have to have a higher protein content. So they probably use a little bit more fish meal. Some of these other fish, like tilapia or some of these catfish, they can take a higher protein content, like coming from soy meal and stuff like that. But when you get into some of these predator fish, you better have a little bit higher fish meal content for survival.
Thank you.
So I just wanted to tie together what I heard in a number of the presentations. Anthony, you talked about how the Great Lakes are not monolithic. The regions, the parts of the lakes are very different, deeper water, shallower water. Rick, you talked about the water strategy and the importance of cleaning up the west end of Lake Erie because of phosphorus problems. Yet I heard Ron talk about a lot of oligotrophic areas, parts of the Great Lakes that are basically lifeless, if you can say it that way, and devoid of life. So that just says to me, when you look at that total picture, and the fact that our fishery is down so much over the last couple of decades, that there's an opportunity to grow fish in those open waters. And of course, sighting is important. We have to do that in the areas. We're not going to do anything like that in west end of Lake Erie, for example. But there are places in the lake where we should be looking at the restoration, the stewardship of those waters, the reintroduction of life into those waters. And I would posit that maybe farming some fish in those waters could be a good idea. And I just want to throw that to the panel and see what you think.
Well, that was Fisheries Oceans Canada did make that kind of recommendation that put them out in deeper water probably would kick the food chain up. And if you look at it, I was at the Great Lakes Fishery Commission meetings, the Upper Lake ones in Sioux, Ontario last year, and EPA, like you said, EPA is making these presentations. I mean, it's pretty serious what's going on out in these lakes with, you know, how the phosphorus is tied up. And also, I mean, and you've probably seen this in the media, I mean, Lake Huron and Lake Michigan are now clearer than Lake Superior. I mean, they presented that at that meeting too.
So you might argue there's an opportunity. Others?
Okay. Well, I think we have about 10 more minutes, so maybe we have one or two questions, if you've got them for us. And then we're going to go back to our panel and have them do some closing remarks.
Could you address the issue of CAFO runoff from the controlled animal feeding operations? We have a concern going on in West Michigan, in Oceana County, with a proposed pig farm, and I understand that there's some increasing amounts of those happening in the state. So could you address the controlled animal feeding operations and how that runoff affects not only inland lakes, but also, and rivers, but also particularly Great Lakes?
Yeah, sure. Is that the one on Flower Creek? Is that the? Yeah. Okay. So I'm a non-neutral party in that. I use these data to essentially put that into broader context of how that particular modification. This is a relatively small watershed with a proposed CAFO siting within 2 miles of Lake Michigan. So at any rate, but in the broader context, we have really pretty decent data on where CAFOs are. At least it defined at a certain size class. You know, it's different by every state. So and within that, we generally know what the approximate waste production is. What we don't know and what aren't made publicly available in Flower Creek or anywhere, at least within Michigan, are the actual manure distribution plans. So in those cases, we do the best we can. We estimate that most of the manure will go to the closest areas because largely it's a liquid manure that's expensive to ship and distribute. So we do the best we can there. There are some surprises in that area in terms of, you know, from the standpoint of when the manure is produced by the animal to how much actually makes it onto the fields. A lot of it, the nitrogen is lost to the atmosphere, and there are other management practices that really do actually result in responsible management of those nutrients. So I'm certainly not going to vilify CAFOs. I think they can be a beneficial means of producing livestock. They meet consumer demand, and that's certainly, you know, sort of hand in glove. Consumer demand responds to things like 69-cent a dozen egg prices, for instance. But yeah, there's a lot that can be done to understand better. You know, if distribution plans are made more publicly available, we might be able to have a better job assessing the impacts of those. Particularly as the burden of regulation falls heavily on state agencies that don't often have large budgets for hiring new technical evaluation staff.
Okay. Nice question.
Anthony, my question is for you. Looking at the large data sets, are you looking at using any drones to help you do the analysis? Is that something that can help assist with interpreting the satellite data and ground truthing it and that type of thing? I'm just interested in the technology aspect of it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we do actually use drone data, especially groups that we collaborate with. What we find is that drone data are really best for understanding at the field scale what you might do to more carefully apply nutrients, more carefully use water. It's something that's broadly referred to as precision agriculture. It's viewed, I think, predominantly as sort of the next big thing and slightly over the horizon, because largely the technical capacity to use drone imagery to make decisions isn't quite there yet, but it's a very active area of research. We have several projects involving that, as well as flown aerial imagery, and it's definitely, with the drop in drone prices and the better and better sensors, I think what we're definitely seeing is industries, for instance, like the grape industry in California, are becoming heavy users of drones in order to better manage their vines. And I think that will start to happen here with specialty crops, where you need to detect pests or other orchard problems that are difficult to survey from the ground, perhaps before you see it in widespread commodity production like wheat or corn or soy, things like that.
You want to sneak one more question in there, don't you? Okay.
Thank you. This is to you, Ron. As someone intimately involved in the aquaculture debate, I'll give that caveat and not go down a lot of rabbit holes. Can you talk a little bit about you said RAS is being limited in some ways. Could you talk about maybe how that's technology driven and whether you see that as more of a cost curve issue where we could see that technology emerge in the next decade or so, or if there's something bigger than that, than just the cost of technology?
Yeah, with these RAS systems, I mean, especially in the northern climate, there's probably a lot of energy costs compared to the south. And I would say if these RAS systems are going to be used, we're probably not in the climate to do it. Farther south, where you have warmer environment, because up here, we have to have a lot of energy to heat buildings, stuff like that. And energy costs, even in these RAS systems, you're going to be running pumps to recirculate water too. So I think our energy cost in these systems farther north is what the big problem is too. And then you start running these fish too. You can only push these densities so high in these systems because you're not replacing a lot of water in these systems. So you're limited. I mean, if you look at our biggest trout producers in Michigan, I mean, those are just flow-through systems. And again, it's probably going to be species driven, and then the best fish to grow in a RAS system is probably a tilapia. Well, you're going to be slammed by foreign countries dropping tilapia on our markets. The higher value fish, if you get into salmonids, whether it's trout or salmon, stuff like that, boy, you're just not going to push them to the high densities you need in these systems probably to be sustainable. So that's the concern I have.
Very good. Thank you for your question. And thank you for your being here today and your attention to the Great Lakes. We're hearing so much about the Great Lakes as not only a freshwater source, a resource, but also as a food systems or food source. And I think it speaks to the world as a system, as a puzzle that all fits together. There's so much conversation about population growth and the need that we have and will have for fresh water and more food than we've ever had to have before. So I think we're moving in the right direction as far as our thought processes go. We're going to move across our panel and have them say a few closing remarks. And again, I want to thank you for being here today. And I hope to see you in April. In April, we're going to be talking about technical education, career and technical education. So it'd be great to have you there as well, April 18th. So Ron, Rick, would you like to kick us off, please?
Thank you again for having me here. There are a lot of potential threats to the Great Lakes. We've talked about many of them, invasive species, climate change, nutrient enrichment. There's also things like emerging pollutants. A lot of you probably been hearing about PFAS that we're finding more and more about. So there are a lot of potential threats, but the greatest threat to the Great Lakes is complacency. It's thinking that they are too vast for us to affect, and if we just leave them alone, they'll take care of themselves. I'd like to do a brief thought experiment for a moment. If you will imagine yourself standing on the top of a sand dune looking out over Lake Michigan, and you're thinking how vast it is. You can't see across it. You look to your left all you see is water. You look to your right, and all you see is water. It's huge, from here to here. And now way out on the horizon, you see a tiny little speck, and it's an ore freighter. And it looks pretty small, although those ore freighters are pretty big. Now, if you imagine that ore freighter off on the horizon, and you take it and you turn it 90 degrees, so it's sticking straight up, and you put it on the bottom of the lake, it's going to be sticking out of the lake. So even though the lake looks like this, on the horizon, the lake is this thin little film on top of the land. And it's a lot more delicate than you might think. So the Great Lakes were a gift from the glaciers 8,000 to 12,000 years ago. Barring a planetary catastrophe, we're not going to have another ice age soon. So it's critical that we protect our Great Lakes. Thanks.
Thank you.
Wow, thank you. That was really phenomenal. So I really love the message, the idea that we have to be active in our management. And you know, I'll say two things. I come from a heavily academic side of things. I grew up in the Kalamazoo area, and I decided I was going to Michigan State University at age 5, and I went there, and I got 3 degrees, and I'm still there. I am solidly from Michigan, and I thoroughly love the region. But I really like to think that my aim is, and the reason I'm in this field is to go outside of academia, to find positive partnerships, to understand that the folks that, you know, we may need regulations in order to improve our environment, those same folks are just folks like you and me who really are trying to actually make a living. And so I've really been humbled to work with farmers and to work with people that are directly acquainted with the idea that, well, we need to meet the needs of our society while also preserving our resources. And then one other just plug for state government spending is that we really value the capacity of our state's DEQ and DNR and all of the jobs that they do. And so I think that's something that I would like to see continued funding for, that it's a real technical resource and a huge capacity for the state in terms of managing our environment.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
I'll open with saying that within the invasive species context, ballast water management has been a huge success story, and that the policymakers who worked so hard to give us that policy deserve a huge pat on the back for having gotten us that far. Now is not the time to relax that. It's only a success insofar as we keep doing it. And that we are still dealing with the after effects of that, with species that came in with ballast and or the earlier mechanism still spreading throughout the region, and getting a handle on how we control that spread is our next big challenge.
I think the biggest impact on me with all these changes in the Great Lakes, I do a lot of work with commercial fishing families, families that make livings off the lake, the bait industry, the charter industry. And over the years, I mean, when I first started back in the 80s, we didn't have an aquatic invasive species problem. They all made a good living. And over the years, they had to adapt. I mean, they say to me, Ron, we didn't cause this problem, but I mean, the bait industry, I mean, the multi-generational. I mean, when I first started, that's why I developed this AIS HACCP program with a colleague from the University of Minnesota. I sat on the Rough Control Committee on Lake Superior when the Rough got up into Duluth and they were going to make their move. Everybody was another oarfish. Everybody was just panicking. First thing they said, we're putting the bait industry out of business. Nobody was thinking, where do you get all this bait, all these retail stores? And those families, I mean, they said, hey, we never caused this. And so we worked with that industry on biosecurity. They stepped up. They spent hundreds of thousands of dollars doing disease testing so they can move it into commerce. So there's been a lot of adaptation. Commercial fishing industry, a lot of value added. They're just not shipping the fish whole to the markets in New York. Now you're going to go to the Straits and enjoy whitefish meals in all these restaurants. So they do a lot of value added, making fillets, fish, smoked fish, sausage. And the charter industry, when I started, was probably 1,000 charter boats in Michigan. Now we're down to just a couple hundred. So all these industries and families have been affected. So I think that's the biggest thing I've seen. I know these families over the years, and it's kind of sad to see the impacts on these families that make a living off the Great Lakes. So That's what I have to say.
Thank you, Ron. So I'd like to ask you to help me thank our panelists. First, hold it, by completing your evaluation. And then secondly, with a round of applause. And thank you for all you do for the Great Lakes.